I would argue that that is probably one of the areas that people don't spend enough energy thinking about is the right type of talent. And that is not necessarily from a resume. I'd say having the right multi-level advocates is really important. Ensuring that you don't just have like Marcus as your advocate in company X, but that you have 3 or 4 through points and touch points, because one of the things that really impacts strategy is not just an organization strategy, but the factors outside of the company, the macroeconomic factors. So how the economy is doing, what's happening with, geopolitical, et cetera, et cetera. Regardless of where you sit within the industry, regulation is going to impact you. And so how do we allow ourselves to be the platform where those conversations happen, where
do you have any specific advice towards, when you're speaking to the CFO?
The first thing is there are generalities that you can make about titles and people. So getting super clear on the key drivers and what success looks like for a CFO would be pretty important.
Yeah.
Words matter. I've noticed myself when I change the language a little bit, it really changes the dynamic. So as an example,
Scarlett, I've been really looking forward to this conversation. You've sat at the middle of FinTech innovation, digital transformation for many decades, really even before it's become a boardroom buzzword in so many ways. If it was BBVA, USAA, Money 2020, you really helped, I think, from an empathetic perspective, this really hard work to get large organizations looking to partner and also build beyond the core. You've launched ventures in highly regulated environments, and specifically, you've really helped push the needle with embedded finance. And so thank you so much for writing as well your book on the topic. I've passed it on to many different executives we've helped over the years. Such a fantastic primer. And so sometimes it's really hard to get everybody on the same page with respect to some of these concepts and where the industry is going in the future. I'd love to today just to really unpack just the way strategic leaders doing this really difficult work and exploring, ventures beyond the core, specifically in the partnering arena, and also building naturally. So maybe a good place to start is, you've done such a fabulous job in getting executives engaged, excited. The platform of Money 2020 sits at the center as well of the whole ecosystem. But just how do you help these individuals really evaluate their ways of looking at this, ways to get beyond the core?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to the show, Marcus. And I get so excited about this topic because, as you and I were talking about offline, doing some of this work more broadly, changing things, as your words, going beyond the core, is not necessarily for the faint of heart. It takes a lot of resilience. It takes a lot of grit. And then you add what you also talked about is adding the layer of the complexity of a highly regulated environment. And now you're really talking a lot of extra stress and work. And so I think for us, when we think about getting people on board, there's a few different ways. And a lot of this goes back to psychology. I have no psychology background, but I happen to be married to someone who was a psych major. So I leverage his knowledge a lot. And it really goes back to like what it is that motivates people. And so when you think about things like pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone, going beyond the core, it is about that individual. So sometimes that is from an emotional perspective. So hey, everyone else is doing it. Why aren't you doing it? So there's a bit of like a fear of missing out. And other times people are led and driven by data. And so here's the stats, right? That we've implemented this technology or followed this protocol or whatever else. And here's been the revenue impact or the cost savings or whatever else. So it really goes back to being empathetic and thinking about what that specific company or person, needs or what motivates them, and then kind of tailoring the pitch to them. And so we've certainly seen that because, back to being such a highly complex and regulated industry, a lot of times to make progress and to move forward, it requires multiple parties coming together. That gets really hard as well. So you're thinking about like, what are the key things that each has unique assets. Like, what is the one thing that defines you that is truly your USP? What is your USP? What is my USP? And then how do those collective USPs come together to actually benefit the end customer, whether that be a business or a consumer or, anyone in between?
Well, I love the fact that you started with the empathy angle specifically. I think that often gets lost in my own experience. I'm doing this work for over a decade. Um, when you think a bit about the filters, is there any criteria beyond the empathetic lens that you'd recommend for leaders to look at when they're kind of just evaluating this kind of growth innovation realm?
Yeah. So part of it goes back to risk appetite. And words matter. It sounds like such a simple thing to say, but I continue to evolve even myself on how I articulate and convey messages, because depending on the audience, the message, the underlying message could be the same, but how you convey that actually changes. And I've noticed myself when I change the language a little bit, it really changes the dynamic. So as an example, failing fast, right? Like, that's a very cool startup thing to say. When you're trying to do this inside of a bigger corporation, that's not necessarily the most. When you start talking about failure, that has a lot of negative implications. Also, when you think about someone who works across borders, failing in certain cultures is also just seen super negatively. I didn't coin this term, so I don't get the credit for it, but a friend of mine started talking about experimenting cheaply. So it's the same thing. You're doing the same thing, but how you phrase it changes and it matters, and all of a sudden people are more receptive to the concept. But I do think the idea of having a bit of risk appetite. So part of it is setting the right strategy. Why are we doing this? Is it because we need to grow revenue? Is it because we're afraid that we're not doing it? Is it because our competitors are doing it? Like, the why is really important. And then how obviously is the next step within that. But to do that, it's where are we trying to go to, and how comfortable are we, like, making the right investments, whether that be time, energy, people, capital. Where is our comfort zone to take those risks, and then kind of go from there. Because until you know that piece, it gets really hard. The other thing, especially when you think about pushing beyond, is how are we measuring this? And does everything have to be measured? Like, part of the measurement might be like, hey, like, we tested this now, so we didn't invest millions or tens of millions of dollars later on a product that wasn't going to go anywhere. So the measurement and KPIs around it are actually really important, or lack of KPIs, depending on kind of what your strategy is.
No, that's fabulous. Experiment cheaply. I think that's certainly, and the words do matter. I mean, I've seen it time and time again. I'm curious, just with the risk appetite perspective, do you feel now, with a lot of the push going forward and the momentum in fintech innovation compared to when you started, are leaders looking at more going on the offense when they're looking at the risk appetite lens, or is it they're playing defense?
It's a really good question.
And it could be more just a sense, right? Like, just in your travels and experiences, specifically with Money 2020, and you've seen so many different perspectives. I'm just curious on the vibe that you're feeling in 2025.
Yeah, the reason I was pausing is because the answer is actually both. Because on the one hand, so if I go back 15 years ago, let's just take the traditional banks for a second. I would say there was a lot of hesitation, doubt, and like, maybe, oh, this isn't actually going to impact us. There's probably some fear too, but let's just not even go there. It's just like hesitation, doubt. I don't actually see this being viable. They're not going to, in terms of, the slice of the pie, it's still quite minimal. Over time, I've seen that desire and intention around actually being more proactive, actually going and testing stuff and not being left behind. So I'd say that from that lens, it's certainly accelerated. On the other side, when you think about it from maybe some of the fintechs, there was a lot of like, the banks are the worst, we're anti-banks, and like, now almost all of them, like, the banks are their clients or they work together. So I think that really changes. I mean, in general, to your question, I would say if I had to choose, I'd say we're definitely more on the people being progressive, people being more excited about the forward momentum. But the other thing is like that one of the things that really impacts strategy is not just an organization strategy, but the factors outside of the company, the macroeconomic factors. So how the economy is doing, what's happening with, geopolitical, et cetera, et cetera. So all of a sudden, if you think about like post COVID, there was some hesitation, then there was a bit of a boom, and then like a lot of money, at least from the money 2020 perspective, a lot of people were really excited about getting together and coming back and coming to events again. And then all of a sudden, even to your world, like there was a bit of capital that was drying up. And so it was like, wait, all of a sudden, are we in the fintech winter? What's happening here? So those things impact the personality and desire to go do big things. But in general, if I were to look in the last decade, I'd say we, as collectively from a fintech financial services perspective, we're definitely more interested in trying new things, interested in testing the boundary. And, you look at the US, which, we're sitting in, you have 5,000 financial institutions, banks, almost 5,000 credit unions. We have seen from our side, like you think about the top 10, 50, more and more downtail, more and more of those are coming to the show, and more of those are interested in learning about new technologies, which is really encouraging and exciting to me.
Yeah, that's an amazing data point and observation too, right? Because you're seeing this continuum of how people are progressing, not just the courage that they're having to take on some of these harder initiatives that would be harder to sell up and to effectively try to drive forward and commercialize. But there is this kind of, I think, appetite. We've noticed it as well, just specifically with corporate venture studios and in the investment side of things. Just given Money's 20, kind of platform globally, have you seen a difference from North America versus the rest of the world, or are you seeing the rest of the world is also really showing a lot of strong momentum to kind of grow beyond the core?
I love that question. So that is one of my favorite parts of my job, is that I get to see what's happening literally on every corner of this, maybe not Antarctica, but everywhere else.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, almost everywhere, where you can see, I have some friends who spend a lot of time down there, so I can maybe get them into fintech. But besides that, I think it's really about, so what's interesting is, from what we've seen, what hits the US first, and then we'll see the impact of that the following cycle in Europe, as an example. And we have a few years of data points to kind of show that. So if something is going really well or is maybe not doing as well, it hits there first and then it follows. That's primarily with the US and Europe. On the Asia side, we really, our footprint and focus is primarily on Southeast Asia. And so that part, I would say, to the question you asked me before about, the desire to heat up and actually get really excited about innovation and change and pushing beyond the core, 100%. Like, because even when I was spending time in the region 5 years ago, 6 years ago, now coming back so many times in the last 2.5 years, there is so much more of a desire to push boundaries. The governments, the regulators are getting much more involved about building out these like next gen economies. Obviously, financial inclusion big over there. From a fintech financial services perspective, they are still so fragmented country to country. So that's why cross-border is so big there. But in any case, like that feels like that's been a big boom. Like that feels like the area where there is a lot of opportunity coming. And we spent a lot of time talking to both, the financial services, traditional, the fintechs, the e-commerce players, the regulators, et cetera. So that one is definitely a bit different. And then we're actually having our first year in Saudi Arabia in next month in September 15th.
I saw that, yeah.
17th. And like, so that is a whole other world. Like I think back to, because you talked about BBVA in the beginning, I think back to what Singapore was doing a decade plus ago, and all the investment they were making, both for the big firms to go open up offices there and then for the startups to come build there. I'm seeing the same thing happening in MENA right now. And like in Saudi in particular, there's just a lot of desire. Like there is that like startup mentality, attitude, excitement. I was just out in Riyadh in May, and it was just like, let's do it. Like there are no boundaries. Let's figure out what we can do together. So that's really exciting to me as well, because they get to take kind of the lessons and learnings from people who have tried before and then apply it to the region. And then also push boundaries on things that haven't happened anywhere and do it there first. So that's what I've been seeing.
That's fabulous. No, thank you for sharing all those insights and perspectives globally. When you think about these principles, and a lot of it, what we've seen is sometimes hard to get momentum or have enough courage for some of these strategic leaders to take the plunge. It's really trying to balance the speed of fintechs with the need for institutional stability, right, and the risk management piece and those elements. Do you have any advice? I mean, really for senior leaders at that stage of just how do they can balance those two competing kind of priorities?
Yeah, so I would say a few things. One of them is, educating. Because to be honest, as you were asking that question in my mind, I was thinking, yeah, it's a bit scary, especially at the pace and scale of what's happening right now, and what's happening in the world and how it's shifting, and the technological advancements are going at a pace that I haven't seen in my lifetime, and so it's a bit scary. So I'd say part of it is about, instead of being resistant to it, like, educate yourself, try it out so you at least feel like familiar and comfortable with it. I think the second part of it is kind of like the convergence of those two worlds is bringing in and hiring the right talent who are experts in that, who are going to push in the right ways. So you have to kind of try to find the people who have the right backgrounds, where maybe they've done a little bit of the traditional, but now have spent a lot of time on the other side, where they can respect and appreciate the complexities and maybe the complications of being in a big company. And there's reasons why big companies are complicated, but then also have the insight, the expertise, and everything else of this next gen new age that they can bring, and then help you do that best in-house. And there's a ton of examples of companies who have done this. Fifth Third Bank is a random one that comes to mind. A friend of mine there, John Piazza, has been building all this stuff inside. And like, Fifth Third isn't a bank that gets a lot of press, but like, he'd come from the fintech side. They hired him, and he's been able to push a lot in what has maybe been considered historically as a bit more of a traditional bank. But anyway, so there's a lot of examples like that. So I'd say part one is go test it yourself, get educated on what's happening, so that you don't have to be the number one expert, but at least be aware of what's happening. And then two is, then you can utilize that, general awareness to help build out a team and hire the right people who can be the ones who actually are experts to help you grow and take things to the next level, and say, hey, actually, we want to stay away from this because this is not the right profile or fit for us, or we're a bit concerned about the longevity of something like this. Like, I think having the right team around you is really important.
I love that you highlighted maybe the balance of the profile that's also required to be successful. I feel in our experiences, sometimes people go way too startup-y and try to bring in this talent into a new lab and hope that they're going to just figure it out. They're going to be able to connect well with the core. And then on the flip side, sometimes it's taking, banking senior leaders and putting them in an environment that is like a fish out of water. They need kind of the blend of that talent. I think is really creates that kind of 1+1=3, maybe hopefully a relationship. And also the point you made about the education piece, which I think is often undervalued. I think a lot what we've seen is, let's do experiments or in a lab, not out on the outside. Let's do a hackathon just to kind of see what's out there for ideas. But I think a lot of it is the applied experiments. I know we were talking about this offline as well, just on the power of partnerships sometimes being kind of a first element in there. I mean, just thinking of your experience also in some of the institutions that you've been there, is there any thing that you could give advice on how to encourage that applied education piece of maybe starting with partnerships, or how leaders should kind of approach that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I'm going to answer that, but I just want to add another comment to where you were going to with the thinking about education and the right background, because it actually goes to your question around partnerships in big companies. So I would argue that that is probably one of the areas that people don't spend enough energy thinking about, is the right type of talent. And that is not necessarily from a resume. So yes, what I talked about before of having the right combination doesn't mean you have to have the corporate and the startup, but something like that is very helpful. And you could see that on a resume. I think a lot about it is like mentality, um, personality, and the ways that people work. And so this is something that I personally struggle with all the time, because I believe, clearly I'm biased, but I believe that I have probably some of the best in class talent that exists in the industry on my team. Now, some of those people are creative geniuses and they don't necessarily do well in overly structured corporate environments. And so that becomes hard because the ability for them to succeed and do their best work is by having a lot of autonomy, not really having like this starts here, this ends here, whatever else, where there's other people who are very much like that. And so the ability to get the best talent that has those different types of personalities and skill sets and how they operate and allowing them to thrive in environments that are a bit more structured is actually really, really, really hard to do. So I think that's just something that, kind of going off your point that people don't really talk about. How that relates to your partnership point though is that, so back to like the skill set thing. So when you think about bringing in these type of partnerships, yes, it is about the expertise. So knowing that this company actually their tech, even though they on their websites look like they kind of have the same product, there's actually some nuance and someone who is the expert will know the difference and say, oh, well, this one has a processing speed of X or Y or whatever else. But then integrating that partnership in, and like partnership is a very important term and it's one that you and I both care a lot about, but it means different things, right? So partnership could be something as simple as you're our customer, like we are traditional, you are startup, and we are using you as the front end for, we're the back end, you're the front end, you're going to be bringing us new customers. But even that, the integration of what that looks like, this company might be used to doing things in 10 days, 2 weeks, whatever. Whereas these ones are like, our integrations take 6 months, 12 months. And so like a person who can be able to say, okay, what really matters here, and how do we make it so these two get closer together is an important one versus a partnership of like, no, truly, we're going to come together. You're going to offer this, we're going to offer this, and we're going to go to market with this. Like that's a different partnership, but the skill sets and personalities around that also still really matter. But I think it's hard too, right? Because like a lot of times people will, especially from what I've seen, the startups see the big names and they want the big names as customers. But oftentimes the big names can't have that level of startup as customers because there's obviously pipeline, whatever else. So it's finding those smaller institutions where you can get to the C-suite really easy, the decision maker in 2 calls, and they have the right risk appetite that we were talking about before to say, hey, actually, we want to do some testing here in a small environment. Like to me, that would help build it out because then you can start seeing, okay, we've done it at a smaller scale. Now we're going to go to a bigger scale, et cetera, et cetera. So anyways, I get excited about partnerships. So
no, I mean, it's so many important points there that you just put forward. I think one thing I just want to highlight again, it goes back to what you said about the stage and the maturity of the startup. And every startup would love to connect or have, said leading, financial institution as a customer, as a partner, a collaborator, however it gets described. But often it is these companies that have to be closer to product market fit, maybe have done a Series A or Series B and beyond, where it really becomes a bit more serious. And I think where, a corporate venture studio plays an interesting role with respect to corporates getting closer is that these executives are spending more time with the startup founders at the earliest stages. And they're kind of bridging and informally even helping both sides understand the pathway to a successful partnership or collaboration in the future. When you think a bit about, the challenges where some of these partnerships lose momentum in the integration phase, like you described, often the time cycles are really different from what the founder ones or the startup ones and larger organizations. Anything that you've seen just to help keep the momentum on the corporate side, so you don't have this like integration fatigue, that kind of this misalignment of expectations, or specifically when they're kind of managing other executive expectations after that first like, oh yes, we're going to do this kind of comes through.
yeah, another very good question. So I'd say a few things come to mind. I'd say part of it is ensuring that you don't just have like Marcus as your advocate in company X, but that you have 3 or 4 through points and touch points, because one of the maybe more challenging sides about the people who tend to do the more progressive things, depending on how things go, are not always the ones who are there in the long term. Certainly sometimes they are, but like making sure that you have multiple touch points in case there is turnover in the organization, because especially if you're on the smaller startup side, doesn't mean that you don't have people who leave your organization. Of course you do, but typically the exec team is for the most part the ones who are going to be there consistently until you get a bit more. And that's a whole other conversation, right? But I'd say having the right the right multi-level advocates is really important. The other thing is bringing in the people who can be the typical like naysayers early, risk, compliance, legal, getting them in early, asking like proactively saying, "Hey, so great that we got the, the LOB, line of business support here, that you're the one who's moving this forward for us. We'd really love to get on a call with your risk, compliance, and legal and team." And then again, like talking about it back to words matter in a way that like makes them feel more comfortable with what you're doing. And I'm sure you might be thinking about this. Here's how we've already proactively thought about AML or whatever else, like depending on the tech, right? Like I think that's the other thing is I've seen a lot of people go in and be not afraid of, but like, oh boy, I'm trying to avoid them and we'll let them bring them in when time comes. Let's try to keep them out of it. The earlier that they get like you get them on, so back to having like the 2, 3, 4 advocates, if they can be those advocates, like your life becomes so much easier. And that was one of the things actually that I love. I mean, I loved many things about BBVA, but we had a risk innovation team. And I haven't spent that much time with a bunch of corporates at that scale again, like I did there, but that was just so fascinating to me. Like we had a team whose job it was to make sure to obviously protect the bank, but also test new things. And they were actively engaged in the conversation. And so that was a unique place to be in.
Well, it's amazing. I mean, thank you for sharing that too, because I think more organizations, regardless if they create a formal group like that, a risk innovation group, but they should have somebody who has that like hat on at some period of time to try to help and support that narrative. And you mentioned earlier too that words really do matter, and I'm glad you brought up like bringing in some of these individuals who could be naysayers or could create some levels of friction in the momentum. So, do you have any specific advice towards when you're speaking to the CFO, think of different personas, different roles, the finance department versus the risk department versus legal. Anything from your experiences pop out that would be helpful in the words that are used? You had a couple great examples before, so I'd love to think if you have anything.
Yeah, I think I'm happy about the CFO because that's another really important internal stakeholder. So I'd say the first thing is there are generalities that you can make about titles and people. So getting super clear on the key drivers and what success looks like for a CFO would be pretty important. The second part is whether you have one, obviously, hopefully more, but even if you have one advocate, getting the like lowdown of what that CFO is looking for. Like in those meetings that you're clearly not in, what have you heard in the past about concerns that she or he has had, and like think about how to tailor it to them. Because again, like the CFO is the one who holds the pocket, so to speak. And so how do you make it like they're trying to make sure that they're, whether it be a public or private company, doing the best that they can to control the spend and put the spend in the right places. So how is what you're doing either helping them control the spend or, generating revenue in new ways? But back to like thinking about it from a risk perspective. So I'd say just getting super clear on like how each one of those specific functions, what success looks like for them and what they are thinking about. And if you don't even have the advocate, when you get on the call with the CFO, it's just asking the right questions to start the conversation of like, so, how are you measured or whatever else? Like, I think it really depends on the situation, but it's going into those conversations, understanding what success looks like for them. And then you tailor your pitch based off of how whatever you're doing is going to make them more successful. And it's not like, it's funny because I've, especially on some people in the past when we've talked about versions of this, it's like, well, that feels a bit misleading. It's like, but it's not though. Like what you're doing is your product is the same. You're just making it more relatable and applicable to the person that you're talking to. It's not that it's misleading. As long as what you're doing is actually going to do that, which by the way, it should be. Otherwise, then maybe you don't have the right product. And like it should be okay. So I think that's a really important thing to be thinking about when you're having those conversations. Like when I go into my meeting with my CFO, I go in with facts and data because I know the questions that she's going to ask me about, versus when I go talk to a peer or when I go talk to the president. Like it's just a bit of a different conversation because I know where her head is at and I know what she's focused on. So
no, so it's such an important point. I mean, it amazes me sometimes. I've been in experiences where for the first time, these people are meeting, in person or in a Zoom call that I'm involved with. And it's shocking because like just being a bit proactive would make all the difference, from just building the trust building even the empathy of taking on this hard challenge of doing something audacious to kind of maybe grow and do innovation in a different manner. And then also, again, having kind of the shared upside, not just the shared risk, right? Get other people involved and engaged, like you said, having multiple stakeholders or leaders involved and engaged over the period of time will help build momentum. On the regulatory component, because you've done so much in regulatory, highly regulated environments, what are again like proactive things senior leaders could do or innovation leaders could do to help maybe create better winning conditions to get ahead of some of the regulatory kind of pushback?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question because I'd say the philosophy is similar to what we were just, or psychology is similar to what we were just talking about. I think I feel a bit in a privileged position for that conversation because one of the things that when I took on this role almost 5 years ago here, that I identified was, I mean, it's not some groundbreaking idea, the importance of regulators, surprise, but, like, really for us, the importance of them at our show, because regardless of where you sit within the industry, regulation is gonna impact you, and so how do we allow ourselves to be the platform where those conversations happen, where the regulators are not people that you see on TV or that you get intimidating letters from, but they're actually ones that you can sit down, have a conversation, have a dialogue with, ask questions to and from. And so we worked really hard on being the place where the ecosystem comes together and has those conversations to the point that some of the, more bigger regulators in the US have come and actually made big announcements at Money 2020 because they want to talk to the industry and hear feedback from the industry directly. So I'd say, in general, it's interesting because we have podcasts ourselves, and I was interviewing the CEO of a co-founder of a big crypto's part of the business over in Europe that are coming to the US. And they were talking about the new rules and regulations and how that's helping them. And so I was just kind of getting into the psychology of how they got there. And they're like, well, we were doing the right thing anyways, kind of seeing where the puck was going, that like, we thought this was what was going to happen. We thought regulation was going to change, but we knew that regardless of whether or not it changes, here are the things that people are going to be concerned about. And we overly invested in the safety and the protocols and the procedures around that. So when regulation changed, they made the bet that it would, that we would be ready for hyper growth. So I thought that was pretty interesting because it is thinking about like where is the industry going more broadly? Where do we think regulation is going to change over the next few years? Because depending on where you are in the world, sometimes regulation is market driven, sometimes it's government driven. And in either case, like setting yourself up for success. So it's like taking the right calculated bets. But should your bet work, like having your basically infrastructure and things ready to go that you can start scaling quickly. And this company did just that.
Yeah, I know it's fantastic that you've been so open and getting regulatory leaders to come globally, be involved and kind of engage into the ecosystem, your platform. We at Highland Data, we've been collaborating in the ecosystem with Coinbase, and they've been really proactive on the regulatory front in different geos throughout the world. Which we've seen as a difference, because that's your point. Again, is like the safety and the regulations exist for a reason. It's there to help create a conduit for more success. They're not the enemy. And I think often there's this approach, sometimes in maybe more the startup ecosystem perspective, given, neobanks experiences, over the years and other fintechs. But like as you mentioned earlier, is now these fintechs have kind of grown up to this next level, and we're seeing more of the power of, corporate partnerships.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it is interesting too, because back to some of your questions earlier around like the impact across geos. So in different parts of the world, it hasn't been historically overly common for different regulators across borders to be spending time together and collaborating on what they could do to move the industry forward. And we're seeing more and more of that. So even at our Asia show in April, we had 23 different regulators from Southeast Asia come together, and we're going to continue to build on that. But it is interesting because I remember I did this stint with Money 2020 back in 19. I wasn't fully working here yet. And I had the CFPB, the OCC, and the FDIC all the directors, chairmans, etc., at the show, all speaking. Because back to I believe this was going to be a thing, and that people were going to care a lot more about it. And it wasn't like it wasn't dead by any means, but it certainly wasn't a packed house. Let's just say that. Forward now, we have those same different people, but same roles at the show back all the shows, but the one in Vegas, 6 years later, and it was literally the busiest show that like, the busiest stage that there was and, like, the biggest so anyways, it's just interesting to see how that changes, but it is about, as you said, like, they are doing things to protect people, and it's going to, like, back to the psychology of, like, okay, how do we help them feel comfortable with what we're doing and show how that we're doing is a benefit, et cetera, et cetera. So, I agree with you.
No, that's amazing. I would love to dig a bit deeper with this in embedded in general, right? Because you really push that forward, embedded finance. You've seen kind of, the early beginnings of experimenting in large organizations. And just what advice do you give again with how do leaders should approach embedded in 2025?
It's an interesting thing because I was contemplating writing a book, for a while, and my girlfriend, who's the co-author of the book, it's actually interesting because it's an Asia example, and I wasn't trying to make it an Asia example, but she's, like, really into reading stuff like, updates and quarterly updates and stuff, and so she was like I was looking at Grab's, quarterly review, and they made more revenue from their finance practice than their delivery practice, like something is here. So fast forward to now in 25, like, how do you think about embedded finance into your corporate structure? I just think about it all goes back to making things as simple and seamless as possible for the end user, whether that be your customers or businesses or whether your customers are individuals, consumers. It's how are you making that experience as delightful as possible? And the other thing that we talk a lot about, you were used the word digital transformation earlier and the different times that that's been brought up. Big data was like the sexy thing forever and then kind of went away now to AI and da 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 da. But like the thing that is interesting though is in 2025, the amount of data that one individual has tells you a lot about who they are and how you leverage and utilize that data to benefit them, whether again they be a business or they be a person, is really, really important. And so there's so much that you can do to actually, help your bottom line, but also help that individual. And, there's just so many examples that we went and explored when we wrote the book, and there's so many more that has come. So even like Clear, I mean, in the US, or the airport, Clear, TSA Pre, two examples. Clear's president, came and spoke at Money 2020 about how they were getting more into financial services because think about the data that they have. It's all about identity verification. How can financial services use this in different ways? And I was like, wait, Clear, like the one that you go to get fast screen. They're like, yeah, no, they just bought a FinTech, and because they want to get more into the space because they say that they are the number one people in identity because they know so much about you based off of all their biometric and blah 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 blah. So I do think it was really just about what is it that is your strategy? What are you thinking about doing? And how are you enhancing the quality of life for your customers? And no matter what, embedding financial services into that will be a better experience for them. As long as it's a better experience for them, then they're going to pay you more for it or they'll benefit in other ways. So yeah, I feel like we're still in the early days of it. The team and I have some disagreements. We do this like prediction thing every year. And one of said embedded finance is dead. So we had a nice debate about that. I think I'm right, now sitting here in August, but
Yeah.
we've seen a lot more examples of other companies come in who are interested in the space, who want to think about leveraging financial services to, offer maybe a more holistic experience for their customers.
No, and I love the fact, I think a lot of folks focus too much on the strategic benefit and the fact that you were just double clicking, highlighting how it's so important, the everyday kind of consumer touch points and delighting them, creating that value for that stakeholder group creates kind of this flywheel of value that will really deliver for larger organizations. At Highline Beta, we invested in a company pretty early on called Walnut Insurance, 2020, end of 2020, all focused on embedded. And you can see how it's progressed. And now it's announced several large, partnership deals with, different FIs and others, other large organizations. And you're slowly getting, that's one of the reasons I was asking the question too, because I'm also getting kind of mixed feedback on the approach that executives should be taking in 2025. Because like the debate you just had with some folks internally is the same sort of thing I'm seeing with executives.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Insurance has some really interesting use cases for embedded finance as well. But yeah, I think there's a long, in a good way, a long way to go. But there is still a lot of momentum that we're seeing and people having really interesting use cases.
Right. And with embedded in finance, are you seeing also the benefits and really supporting more kind of financial inclusion as kind of a macro theme? Just thinking from the inception of when you published your book, and I guess that was 2022, I think it was, to now, it's only 3 years, but certainly I'm curious your perspective on that.
It's quite funny because I was just having a chat this week with a publisher about what type of evolution we want to do on embedded because there are some really interesting use cases that we're seeing. I think I might just do an article on it, but as opposed to a full book because I wanted to get out there sooner rather than later. But
Yeah.
I think 100% there's been, to your question around the financial inclusion. So going back to the comment before around like people's data, um, historically, if you were not with us, if a traditional financial service organization, they were the only ones that were able to say that this is who Marcus is, and therefore, because of X, Y, or Z, he is credit worthy or not, and this is why he can get this, this advance in a loan or whatever else. Whereas now there are so many trillions of data points about Marcus that actually, through embedded finance, will enable us to give you a better experience where we know that you do XYZ. So the example, I think I gave it in the book, but if not, it's one that I like to use a lot where even let's just say that you are the bank or not, whatever you are, you have some type of relationship with Marcus, you know a lot about you. And all of a sudden, if there's an area where you're having a direct deposit and you know that, 2 times a week or 2 times a month, you're having money come into your account, all of a sudden that stops happening. That is a trigger for you to go and reach out and say, hey, looks like there might be, what's going on here? Everything okay? Do you need a short-term loan? No interest. Like, because it is about like offering better experiences there. But that's probably not the best example of financial inclusion, but it's definitely one that kind of helps there. But it really is about helping to take these generations and huge populations of people who don't either have no relationship with financial services or minimal, who are still, putting money in other places and utilizing their information, their money, their data to actually make their experience better and help them grow their wealth. And wealth, when people think about wealth, they're like, oh, well, we're like, wealth could be a pound, it could be $1, it could be whatever. It's like growing that money matters and having some stability and security around that. So yes is a short answer. There are so many opportunities for financial inclusion within embedded finance. And there's been some really good progress, but we still have, a long way to go there as well, I'd say.
Yeah, in a former life, I ran a financial literacy company. And I think this is like a fantastic example also of applied education, right? So being able to put those insights, doesn't matter the quantum of dollars or wealth like you described, that it makes such a huge difference in somebody's life. And then they get kind of hooked. Well, what else? What other better decisions can I make? What are the consequences to the actions I make? And certainly those opportunities, I think it just really helps the overall ecosystem. And certainly I think, the most progressive strategic leaders are taking, how do we make impact in society? And I feel like, everybody sometimes thinks, okay, fintech, oh no, another fintech is coming through. But these applications, the value that these fintech innovations can make, I think have such a double benefit, both to the bottom line of large organizations, specifically financial institutions, but also the impacts in everybody's lives.
Absolutely. The interesting thing, because I keep going back to the question you asked around differences across geo, in Asia in particular, especially Southeast Asia, but across the board, the open talking around financial inclusion and like, I should go put this through an AI, but if I went put all of the content from the show in April, I would take a estimated guess that 70+% of every session, someone talked about financial inclusion. Like it would just, not that the entire session was about that, but it would naturally come up as part of the conversation. And that it like, it's just, it's such a part of their natural time and the way that they speak about things, even the themes that we put. Cause I kind of push by the team to the team. I'm like, you're doing so much heavy, like it's all about inclusion. Like there's something they're like, this is what matters here. Like we've read all of the data, we've done all of this quant and qual researching and interviews, and people want to talk about this. So it's interesting because it's true across the board, and financial inclusion is applicable here in the U.S. as it is other places, but they're talking about it a lot more.
Right. It's quite, fantastic to hear that it's authentically coming out in that conversation, right? It's not like it's a headline topic, but if that's the case, again, I think another great example of how fintech innovation can make societal impact. Yeah, we'll shift gears a little bit and get to a bit of a rapid fire just to kind of close this off. Really appreciate your time. And this is really more about you as a leader, of course. But what's one thing you think all successful people do that nobody really talks about?
I'd say says no to things that basically is more intentional about what they say yes and no to.
Yes. That's a fantastic answer. I think that's one that I'm actually applying more to in my own life these days. Right. And what is like one decision you've made, in your career that's really changed its trajectory?
To be honest with you, coming to Money 2020, I loved the brand. I had been to the show. I'd seen the show from every angle. But I was quite convinced in what the world thought was the right world or title or company or whatever. And I was like, but I don't belong in events. I'm a fintech person. And I let that go and focused on where I felt happiest. I had the advantage of having done a stint here where Money 2020 was my client, but I let that go, and I have had the best job of my life for the last 5 years, and something that I get passionate about basically every single day waking up to.
No, that's amazing. And just tell me, one time we really, trusted your gut instinct more than anything else that's going to help you move forward in life professionally.
One is hard, but I'll give you one personal, one professional. So I moved to New York without knowing. I went to university here without knowing a single person. My family was not excited about it. I'm from a really small town in Colorado, and a lot of people don't go so far outside of Colorado, maybe to Arizona or California, but it's quite rare to make it all the way over to the coast.
Yeah.
And I felt very adamant that I was an athlete. I was a very competitive person, that I need to be in the biggest city to be the best version of myself. And then even getting into banking, like that first job at BBVA, I had quite a negative relationship with money, to be honest with you. I grew up with a lot of family strife as it relates to money. And so, I also was of the age and came out of college. I was in college around the time of the financial crisis. And so I had quite a negative view of financial services more broadly. So I never saw myself going into it, but I really got to know BBVA, and I just loved the organization. And now my entire career is a result of that. So that's what I would say.
No, fabulous. Well, I just want to sincerely thank you for all the impact you're making in the overall ecosystem. And just, again, we'll see you at Money 2020, in Vegas. And I know a lot of our community will continue to attend the events all over the world. So thanks again, Scarlett. Appreciate it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Marcus.